Hi again, everybody. So this next video for the deviance unit has to do with labeling theory. Labeling theory is closely connected to symbolic interactionism. This is one of our big theoretical perspectives. And labeling theory is especially relevant to deviance. So you've read in the textbook, and we talked about in the previous video, how deviance is doing an action that is different than the norm. And by doing an action that's different than the norm, that's what deviance is. Labeling theory says that there's an additional requirement, that it is possible for two people to do something different than the norm, but only one of them to be perceived as being deviant. So labeling theory says that there's two components required for any instance of deviance to take place. The first is what's called, under labeling theory, primary deviance. And this is what we've been talking about. Somebody doing something that's different than the norm. Secondary deviance is the next thing that's required, and this is the reaction of the people that observe this thing. So if a person does something different than the norm, but the people who observe it or anybody around doesn't perceive that as being bad or wrong or different, well, then no deviance has happened at all, according to labeling theory. Now, there's a video that's included as part of this, which I'm not going to show right now, but it's on this next slide here. So when you're going through the PowerPoint slides, be sure to look at this, because this does illustrate labeling theory very clearly. When you're watching it, be especially attentive to how the interactions first begin. Like, what are the first words that come out of the people's mouths as they're observing the actors in the various stages of their performance while they're engaged in the activity that they're engaged in? What assumptions are being made by the people who are around the actors? And there's very, very different assumptions being made that we can decipher based on the very first things that come out of their mouth when they start interacting with the actors. So labeling theory looks at and applies labels to different groups of people. Now, based on your demographic traits, you have labels that are attached to you too. And this is where, and we've been talking about this in pieces through symbolic interactionism. Again, how we define things, how we understand things, what labels are attached to people. When I think about myself, as a man, I have certain labels attached to me. And you can think about these things as very similar to the way we think about stereotypes of things, but it's not exactly the same. So how do we define what it is to be a man, right? And then how do we define what it is to be a woman? How do we define what it means to be a young person? How do we define what it means to be an old person? How do we define what it means to be from the South? How do we define what it means to be from California? How do we define what it means to be white? How do we define what it means to be black or Asian or Hispanic or Latino? How do we define these things, right? What traits and characteristics go along with those demographic traits? These are very important under labeling theory, because these are often used as guides within the minds of people to determine whether or not that secondary deviance ever happened. How do we define a college instructor, right? So myself, like what are the characteristics and traits that I have? And then how do we define a college student? What are the characteristics and traits that a college student has? And how are those two different definitions different from one another, right? Because if you remember, when you I have seen, when I go to the gas station, it's not uncommon for me to see a sign at the door that says only 2 students at a time, or students must leave their bags at the door. Now, why is that? The connotation is that because the students can't be trusted not to steal something, right? The assumption is that they are inherently untrustworthy. Now, as an adult and not a student, I am every bit as capable of stealing something from the gas station as anyone else is. But if I walked into that gas station with my bag, they wouldn't tell me to put it down. right? So these labels, these assumptions, these tags that we put on people about the expectations of their behavior are hugely powerful, because they guide the way that other people are going to interact with them. Hence the sign on the door, right? This is an example of labeling theory. Some of these labels are really, really strong and negative. And these really strong, really powerful, really negative labels are called stigmas. And there are stigmas that are associated with some groups of people, but not others. As a man, there are very few stigmas attached to me as compared to women. Women have a number of stigmas attached to them. One of them, as you'll see exemplified in that video that I was just talking about on the slide before this one, is lack of ability. Women have this stigma, this label, that they are not very good at doing things, right? That they need help to do stuff. Especially they need men's help. As you will see in that video, labels, the stigma labels, right? Stigmas also generally apply to racial minorities. Now in the video that you'll watch or have watched, the black actor has a stigma attached to him. And the stigma that's attached to him is criminality, right? The idea that he is more likely than others to be a criminal or to be a thief. Now, importantly, this isn't attached to that actor specifically, because nobody knows who that guy is, just like the woman in the video. Nobody knows who she is, right? They just know that she's a woman and he's a black guy. And because of that, become those stigmas attached to those groups. So the stigma is not attached to the person, it's attached to the groups that the person belongs to. One of the things that's another important component about deviance is what is called medicalizing deviance. And when you medicalize deviance, what you do is you explain away deviant behavior based on some medical condition. So the idea is that person would not have done those kinds of things if only they didn't have this medical condition that they have. It's the medical condition that is responsible for their deviant behavior, not them. They are not responsible. The medical condition is responsible. So you'll see this exemplified in some laws in some countries where they say that a person who is caught stealing needs to have their hand cut off, right? Because it's not that they made a bad decision, that they were just deviant, but there's something fundamentally wrong about them, right? That they have something wrong with their brain, that in order to stop them from stealing, we have to eliminate their hand because it's a medical issue. Right? Talking to them about it or sanctioning them for it in some other kind of way, don't do that anymore, or you're going to go to jail, or here's a fine, that's not going to work, because the problem with them is that they have some kind of medical problem that causes them to steal. So then the solution for that is a medical one, and in this case, a barbaric one, obviously, but cutting off of the hand, right? That's how we solve that issue. Okay? This is medicalizing deviance. But we don't need to look in other countries to see medicalizing deviance. Medicalizing deviance happens a lot here in the United States, especially when one of these mass shooting events happens. We see medicalizing deviance a lot during these mass shooting events. So I've gathered up some portraits of some people who have been involved in some of these mass shooting events. And you may or may not be familiar with who these people are, but I'll let you know as we go. This first picture, this is one of the two guys who was responsible for kind of the granddaddy of all mass shootings at Columbine High School. Him, along with his friend, went into Columbine High School with firearms and pipe bombs, and they slaughtered tons of people in the high school. In the immediate aftermath of this, right away, as they were still investigating what was happening and people were still in the hospital and cops were still on the scene, the narrative about this guy and his partner from the police and from the media, from other people, were that these guys were depressed. These guys maybe were schizophrenic. Maybe these guys had bipolar disorder. Maybe these guys were bullied, and that's why, right? But it was some kind of medical condition being looked at to explain why they would do such a horrific thing. And if it makes sense to ask questions like that, one could make a good argument about that, I think. Like if somebody is going to walk into a place and murder tons of people, then maybe we should question if there's something different about the way that they think, right? But hold on to that idea, because we don't always do that. This second guy, this is the guy who went into Sandy Hook Elementary School, and with his gun, he shot and killed 2 classrooms full of kindergarten and first graders and their teachers. And again, in the immediate aftermath, while the cops are still on the scene, before all the bodies are cold, again, questions about his sanity, right? Does he have bipolar disorder? Is he schizophrenic? Is he depressed? So on and so forth. This guy is the one who went into the Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, and after praying with the leader of that church and the members of that church, took a gun out and executed them all. In the immediate aftermath, again, there was questions about whether or not he was sane. Did he have schizophrenia? Was he bipolar? Was he depressed? Right? Again, all these questions. It ran contrary even to his very early stated opinion that his goal of his actions was to ignite a race war. He thought by attacking the Emmanuel AME Church, which is a historic black church, very important within the black religious community, that he would be able to start a war between black and white people nationally, right? That was his goal. That's what he said. He wrote a manifesto about it. That was his goal. He proclaimed over and over and over again that was his goal. Yet, the narrative still continued that, there must be something mentally wrong with this guy. Okay? A couple more here. This guy is the guy who went into the premiere of The Dark Knight in Colorado, dressed all in police SWAT outfit. So he looked like a Colorado police SWAT officer. He, premeditatedly dressed himself like that so that when the shooting was all over, he could easily blend in with the forces that would come to stop him, and he would be able to get away. That was his thinking. Again, right away, questions about his sanity, whether or not he was all put together or not. Did he have some kind of mental disorder? Was he bipolar? Was he schizophrenic? Was he depressed? Again, all these questions immediately from the media, from the police officers, from people in politics, right? All asking these questions about his sanity and whether or not he had any kind of mental illness. This guy walked into a recruitment center in Tennessee and pulled out his gun and killed 5 to 6 people in that recruitment center. Okay, another mass shooting event. There were no questions about this guy's sanity. Okay, there was never any statement from the media or from the politicians or from the police, as there have been in these previous cases that I've showed you, about whether or not this guy was depressed, whether or not he had schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, any of those kinds of things. Immediately, it was about terrorism and a terrorist attack. Okay, very different kind of language, right? Very different kind of framing, right? Nobody ever asked any questions about this guy. This guy is an American. He's born in America. He was a University of Tennessee college student. And never had any kind of ties to any terrorist groups, terrorist organizations, terrorist social media outfits, any of those kinds of things. Okay? This guy was perched at the top of a parking garage in Dallas, and at the end of a Black Lives Matter rally that he was not a part of, he opened fire on the police officers who were protecting the Black Lives Matter rally. They were the protection group for the rally, and when the rally ended, the march ended, this guy had perched himself at the ending point and started shooting and killing them. Again, there were no questions about this guy's sanity. There were no questions about whether he was depressed or anything like that. Again, the immediate discussion focused on his criminal record, right? That he had been arrested at some point in the past for marijuana possession, that he had been involved in some kind of domestic dispute with a previous girlfriend. It should be noted, I think, that this guy is a former United States soldier who, in fact, did have a diagnosed and confirmed case of post-traumatic stress disorder. So this guy actually did have a mental illness that he was dealing with at the time of his actions. Now, why do we go through all of these? Remember, we're talking about the medicalization of deviance. When we saw these guys commit their horrific acts, and we saw these guys commit their horrific acts, all of these guys are horrible, horrible people for what they have done. But the way that our society looks at them and their actions is very, very different. For these perpetrators who are white, they had their deviance medicalized, right? It is some kind of mental disorder. It is depression. It is schizophrenia. It is bipolar disorder. This is the thing that caused these otherwise okay kind of guys to do this horrible kind of thing. That same thing was not done and is not done when the perpetrators are non-white. Here, when we have a person of Middle Eastern descent, it's about terrorism. Here, when we have a person of African descent, it's about criminality. And again, this is based on labeling, right? These stigmas that attach to you based on your group membership. And labeling is a privilege of the dominant group. If you went to Saudi Arabia or Iran, do you think that people like this that look like this are labeled as terrorists? They're not, because the majority, the dominant group in those countries look like this. So there's some group of people who probably gets labeled as terrorists, but it's not based on looking like this. And if you go to Uganda, or if you go to Niger, or if you go to South Africa, do you think people like this are identified as being criminal? No, because the dominant group there looks like this. So some group there is identified as being a criminal, but it's not based on having brown skin, because that is the trait that the dominant group has. Okay? Labeling is a privilege of the dominant group. Here in the United States, the dominant group is white males. Okay? So when you look at actions that are these gross mass shooting event, horrible actions, these perpetrators here all have their deviance medicalized so that no stigma gets attached to them and their group. When you medicalize deviance, there's a couple different things that happen. The first thing is what we talked about previously, is you take some of the blame off the person, right? When you medicalize deviance, some of the blame goes away, because you're saying that, well, if that person didn't have that medical condition, well, then they wouldn't have done this thing. So it's at least in large part, the fault of this condition, not the person. Right? So it's the condition that you have to be worried about, not the person. If the person didn't have this condition, they wouldn't have done that thing. Okay? That's what medicalizing deviance does. The second thing that happens follows that, right? If it's this condition that you have to worry about,
Well, then now what you've done is you've stigmatized this condition. So now that anybody who has bipolar disorder, anybody who has depression, anybody who has schizophrenia is potentially now a mass shooter. If anytime a mass shooter commits a mass shooting, you start asking and talking about depression and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, well then you're saying then that people who have that condition are not predisposed to do these kinds of actions, which is not true. Okay? The third thing that happens is that you protect the group that the deviant actor belongs to. It's one of the reasons why there have been more terrorist activities and more deaths from terrorism in the United States from people who look like this than people who look like this. But we don't think about people who look like this as being terrorists. We think about people who look like this as being terrorists. Society generally does. I'm using we in a broad sense. Not you and I, but in a societal level sense. Right? That a terrorist is more likely to be identified by more Americans as looking like this person than this person, which runs contradictory to what the facts actually are. Right? That is a product, in part, of medicalizing deviance. Okay? It's incredibly, incredibly powerful. And it carries over so that even when you're not engaged in any kind of deviant or bad activity, these labels still apply to you. So here are some people who were not engaged in mass shooting events that you may have been familiar with, right? This guy's name is Eric Gardner. He was a very famous case from New York City. He was standing outside on the sidewalk selling loose cigarettes to people who would pass by and ask for them. He was strangled to death by police officers. This guy here is John Crawford III. He was inside of a Walmart. He picked up a BB gun or airsoft gun off of the shelf at Walmart that they sell at Walmart to purchase it. He went over to the snack aisle to pick out some snacks. He's talking on the phone. And while he's there choosing his chips or candy or whatever, the police round the corner and shoot him to death because someone called in that there is a dangerous man waving a gun around in Walmart. Right? There's video of both of these events that I don't have here, but if you're interested, you can look up and see. And it runs counter to the way that police interactions occur with other members of the population. So in these two instances, even though both of these guys are not armed at all, they are perceived as violent, dangerous threats because of the labels that are attached to their group. In this case, the group is black males, right? They are so dangerous and so violent that I am afraid for my life in any encounter with them, regardless of whether they are armed or not. And you contrast that with interactions that happen with white members of the society who can, as displayed in this picture, literally have their hand on their gun, ready to draw their gun, but the police officer still feeling safe enough to not do the same. Because those stigmas are not being applied to that group. Now, race is a very powerful factor here, but it is not the only factor here. Okay? There's also a dimension of social class. There's a very famous sociological study that was done that looked at two groups of teenage boys in the same town. Both of the groups of boys were 100% white, so there is no race dimension. It was only about class. One of the groups of kids were middle upper class kids, and the other groups of kids were lower working class kids. The middle upper class kids were identified by the researcher as the quote unquote saints, because this is how the people in the town referred to these boys. And the lower middle class, lower working class kids were identified as the quote roughnecks, because this is how the town referred to these boys. Now, all of these boys, these are high school kids, all of these boys were engaged in deviant behavior. The saints were documented as being truant from school, underage drinking and driving, petty theft, and vandalism. Okay, so they're doing all these small kinds of crimes. The roughnecks kids were engaged in truancy, underage drinking, petty theft, and vandalism, but not drinking and driving like the saints were, because they didn't have access to cars. Their families weren't wealthy enough to provide cars for them to drive around. So you have the saints kids being participatory in more and more severe deviant behavior, potentially life-threatening and threatening to the public, drinking and driving. They are engaged in more and more severe deviant behavior than the roughnecks kids, but because of how the people in the town perceived these two groups of people, the police watched only the roughnecks kids. The police expected the roughnecks kids to be engaged in crimes, and they were engaged in crimes, just like the saints kids were. But since the police only perceived the roughnecks kids to be doing this, those are the ones that they watched. And when they watched them, they caught them, because they were engaged in those behaviors just like the saints were. And because they weren't watching the saints, they didn't catch the saints participating in these crimes. So then their bias was confirmed, right? So if you know what, I think these roughnecks kids are up to no good. We should watch them. So we watch them, and then we catch them being up to no good. See, I knew they were up to no good. Hey, these saints kids, I think they're pretty good. I think they're not breaking any laws. We don't have to watch them. As I'm not watching them, they're breaking all kinds of laws, doing all kinds of horrible things, but I don't see it. See, I knew I was right. See, they never did anything wrong. It's where we choose to focus our attention, and the labels that we associate with different groups of people based on their demographic traits have profound effects on our perception of their deviance and their deviant behavior. Okay? Really, really important. So this is all about labeling theory. So in this video, we've looked at labeling theory, looked at what medicalizing deviance is, the two different types, the two different components, of labeling theory, the primary deviance and secondary deviance, medicalizing deviance and the three effects of that, which are reducing responsibility on the deviant actor, stigmatizing the medical condition, and protecting the group to which the deviant actor belongs. We also applied that to several cases of mass shooting events, and then looked at how those stigmas apply and then have consequences based on that. Specifically and especially with regards to race, but also with regards to social class. Okay? If you have any comments or feedback, I'd love to hear it. You can leave them in the comments below. And I'll see you in the next video.